let's get into the football now with John here on 97.3 ESPN. Follow him on Twitter at JF McMullen, and he joins us now with a look at all the NFL news and notes. Johnny, what's up, man?
Hey, Michael. Second wild card. I mean, nobody's lost since the Eagles won the Super Bowl.
That's right.
So I'm going 162-0.
Flyers will win tonight. Sixers will beat the Heat. I mean, it'll all be a kumbaya while the Phillies start their pitchers and catchers tomorrow. Real quick on the Eagles, we talked a little bit yesterday, but there's some thinking that the Eagles could kind of go with an unconventional look at their offensive coordinator spot now that the Giants have filled theirs.
Yeah, and it's looking more and more they're going to go in that direction and sort of split the duties Frank Reich had with Mike Rowe and Deuce Staley, which would kind of put out, I suppose, two potential fires because you have two assistant coaches who probably feel they believe they should be the next in line. And obviously, if you promote one and don't promote the other, you could create some issues. So Doug Peterson kind of thinking outside the box, and that's been one of his strengths since he's taken over the head coach of this team, is managing personalities. We usually talk about that with the players, but here it seems he's going to be managing the personalities of the coaching staff, which is also important.
Any sense that one of these guys would be, I don't want to say turned off or disappointed. I'm sure they'd be disappointed, but that there would be a problem if one guy doesn't get it over the other?
Yeah, I think that's the issue. I think we kind of dived into it at least a little bit yesterday. I think the mentality is that probably Mike Groh's background is a little bit more suited toward being an offensive coordinator. But on the other side, you have Deuce Staley. He's got a long history with this organization and is very popular with this organization, and a lot of people think he should be next in line. So that's tough because Mike's only been here for 1 year versus Deuce's history with obviously as a player, but also he's been here for a long time as a coach as well, preceding Doug and even Chip Kelly. So it would have been difficult to just promote Mike Groh, I think. So if you go the way which I think they're leaning, and that's Mike Groh as the sort of passing game coordinator, Deuce Staley is the running game coordinator, and they both contribute to the game plan. Titles to be determined, whether that's the actual terminology they use or not. I think that accomplishes a sort of avoiding a potential pitfall.
Yeah, and I don't know, has that been done before where there's co-offensive coordinators? Has there been another situation where you have seen something like that happen?
No, but the league has been changing. There are head coaches who call plays that haven't had coordinators in the past. Hugh Jackson last year didn't have an offensive coordinator. That worked out well, but that's probably not the best case scenario. And there's been sort of new terminology. The assistant head coach tag is often thrown around to keep people from leaving. You have Brad Childress getting the spread game analyst tag from Andy Reid. Obviously Brad was his offensive coordinator here, and then as he went out to Kansas City, it was first Doug and Matt Nagy, and he had Brad Childress on that staff as well. And now Brad's gone with Matt Nagy to Chicago. So there is this sort of innovative titling that is starting to gain traction in the league.
Yeah.
So I don't think you're going to be seeing co-offensive coordinators. I think it'll be, as I said, it'll be more passing game coordinator, perhaps running game coordinator, or maybe some other terminology, as I said, like spread game analyst for Mike Groh or something of that nature.
John McMullen's with us. You wrote this morning about how the Eagles survived going from Wentz to Foles by having an open mind, and I guess that's a description of how Doug Peterson and the staff that is now no longer here created and designed plays for Foles, essentially, not calling plays that were made for Wentz.
Yeah, and John DeFilippo kind of admitted that during his opening conference call with the Minnesota media when he took the offensive coordinator job, and he said, look, that's what coaching is. And he's explained that the Eagles, specifically him and Frank and Doug Peterson, sat down Nick Foles, and they asked him, what are you comfortable doing as a player? Because as John pointed out, we're not throwing the football. You're throwing the football on game day. So he was very upfront with them, and he told them what he felt comfortable doing, what he enjoyed doing, what he felt he was good at, and they sort of rebuilt the offense very quickly with that in mind.
Do you think he came out and said, well, I really like what Chip did for me in 13?
Well, I think that was part of it because I think people look at maybe not in that sort of terminology, but as far as the quick reads and the one read kind of stuff, that was probably part of it. And that was what he was successful at. And I think people look at Nick and see a 6'6" guy who's not that athletic and assume he's a pocket quarterback. But
right.
I think we've seen enough of him to know that's not the case. And he is better making quick one-read decisions. And he's not going to be, Peyton Manning going from progression 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. He's not going to be that type of quarterback. And I think if you embrace that and try to accentuate the strengths of a player and sort of mask as many deficiencies as possible, that's what the Eagles and this coaching staff was able to do. And they deserve a lot of credit for that because there are a lot of closed-minded coaches in this league that say, my scheme is my scheme, and you're going to run my scheme. And there are more of those coaches in this league than the opposite. And as John pointed out to me, it's common sense. Why would you ask a player to do something he's not good at? And I think that is, as I said, it's common sense, but it's common sense that's very uncommon in this league.
John McMullen on the air on the Boardwalk Honda hotline. Frank Reich apparently going to call his own plays out in Indianapolis. And we talked about this throughout the course of the year. I think that was something that early in the season, John, we kind of were critical of Doug for, right? We were saying you can't do all the stuff, calling plays, being the head guy. And now it seems that it's going back the other way where, well, Doug called the plays. Now Frank's going to call the plays. It seems that it's amazing how one guy does something and it works and how that could change, the league could change because you also have the kid out in L.A. that calls plays. I mean, now you're starting to see these head coaches that are the play callers taking those play call duties back over.
Well, I think that's always been the mentality for first-time coaches. And I always got to go back because I talked to Tom Coughlin about that. I still think ultimately long-term the best coaches are CEO coaches, guys who oversee the whole team on game day, simply because there's too much to do. And when you aren't bogged down calling plays, you tend to have time management issues. You tend to forget other aspects of the game because you're so focused on one job. Now, Doug was a brilliant play caller, so people are going to lean on that. And I can't disagree with that. But, what Tom said is when you are the coach, you have to basically call plays when you first get the job because you're trying to instill your system and instill your philosophy on the entire building. And then as you get more entrenched, you generally feel more comfortable, especially if you get assistant coaches. You teach your system and you have confidence to delegate. Then you can sort of morph into the CEO coach. So I think it's always been that way. First-year coaches are always going to call their plays, whether it's offense or defense. But I still think long-term, CEO coach is the best way to go. Now, as for Doug Peterson, hey, most coaches in this league can't call plays like Doug.
Right.
Let's be honest. So he might be the exception to the rule because at least this season he proved to be one of the best play callers we've seen in recent NFL history, to be honest.
And I guess a lot of people will have their eye on Indianapolis this year and how Frank calls plays, and I guess Minnesota to see how John DeFilippo calls plays, to see if it was Doug who had that intuition, or was it a collaboration of the guys? You know, how much input did those guys have on game day of play calling? And it seems that not a lot, but I guess we'll find out.
Well, I think definitely the aggressive part was Doug, and so that part he deserves a lot of credit for. And he kind of explained at times, you know, what Frank was able to do is sort of mold aggression and avoid recklessness. So maybe that part suffers a little bit, or if Doug learned from Frank and vice versa. Because Frank has got to bring some of that aggression, and so does John DeFilippo.
Right.
Because if that doesn't exist and you're giving up possessions, I think that was the biggest strength. I've said it time and time again on the show, Mike. I think it was the biggest strength of this offense versus every other team in this league. The Eagles didn't surrender possessions automatically. They often went for it on fourth down. They were often successful. And I think that gave them a huge advantage over just about everybody they played.
John, let's look at some NFL stuff here. The Giants are going to hire Mike Shula to be their new offensive coordinator. Last we heard from him was, in Carolina?
Yeah, and Dave Gettleman is obviously the GM there and had him in Carolina. He certainly wasn't the first choice. Kevin Stefanski was the first choice, but the Vikings blocked him from leaving. Some people in New York say Deuce Staley was the second chance, but the Eagles were not going to allow him to interview because he's under contract. So ultimately they had to go in a different direction. And they got a guy who's been very successful. He's called plays in the past. He's got a lot of experience. Obviously, Pat Shurmur's going to be calling the plays, so he's sort of taken a step back from that standpoint, but he's certainly a veteran coach, and I think they could have done a lot worse.
Yeah, the Giants are in an interesting situation because you got Shurmur, obviously, as you said, going to call plays, but that's a team that I find very interesting. They won, 11 games a year ago, and last year were just decimated by injury, and you're going to get a lot of those guys back. I think a lot of people look at that team as needs a complete overhaul, but might not be the case if they come back healthy and just have a new coach with, a more disciplined mindset.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think, that team is not far away, and we see worst to first every year in this league. We just saw it with the Philadelphia Eagles. And I'm not going to say that's sort of developing there, but they have a good general manager. They have a good personnel guy. They understand they have to rebuild the offensive line now. They have a much better coach, a much better play caller in Pat Shurmur. So I think the recipe is at least there. However, the elephant in the room is, and I've said it a lot, they have to move on at the quarterback position. And we'll see if they have the guts to do that.
I doubt it. I didn't think they were anyway, but I doubt they do now, right? If you have Eli, and I know that you and I might not be the biggest Eli guys, but he's still a guy that has been to the playoffs, won Super Bowls, they probably feel that they have a playoff caliber roster if they're healthy. So why would you turn that over to a rookie?
Well, I think you have to take the mentality Howie Roseman did, and it was a little different from Howie's perspective because he moved up in the draft twice. But his mentality was, we don't plan on being in the top 10 of the draft very often. So if you have an opportunity to go get the quarterback, you're not going to be there. Seize on that opportunity. I think the Giants have to take that same mentality. But they're in a position to just take the quarterback. They don't have to move up. And unless they plan on being in the top 5, forget about top 10, obviously picking number 2 overall, they have to get a quarterback. This is it. This is their opportunity to get the next quarterback for the next 10 years. I think it's a no-brainer from their perspective.
Yeah, no, I think they probably have to draft a guy, but to trade, well, I don't know. Maybe I mean, they're at number 2. You get to number 2. I mean, they to pass up on a quarterback. The problem I always have is to take a quarterback just to take a quarterback if there's not a guy you like.
Well, I agree with that, but this is supposed, and it's very early in the process, but this is supposed to be a deep draft as far as quarterbacks. There's always at least 2. You know, we constantly hear it. You can go back to the Jared Goff, Carson Wentz year, and the narrative was that it wasn't as good as Jameis Winston and Marcus Mariota the year before. It turns out it was better, mainly because of Wentz, but nonetheless, if you're talking about the top 2 picks in the draft, and you go throughout college football and say there's not going to be 2 guys that belong up there with the value of that position, I just don't believe it. And ultimately, I think Dave Gettleman is too smart and too savvy, and he understands at the bare minimum, even if you want to move forward with Eli Manning, you know he's close to the end of the line. This is your opportunity to go get the quarterback.
Yeah.
Now you have to make the decision who's the better quarterback, whether it's Sam Darnold, whether it's Josh Rosen, whether it's somebody else. You have to make that decision correctly, but nonetheless, it's there for you, and you don't want to have to go through that again.
John, a couple things in the NFC East. Let's take a look at some possibilities for each team here. Dallas, let's start with them. I guess the Dez Bryant question is going to come up a lot. What's your feeling on Dez Bryant's future in Dallas?
Well, he's going to have to redo his deal. There's no question about that. I said it a lot during the season. I mean, Dez Bryant had the reputation as being a true number 1 receiver, and at one time he was in this league. He was one of the best 3 or 4 receivers in football. But ever since that Jones fracture, hasn't been the same guy athletically. He's turned into sort of a possession receiver. He's still a big, strong guy. He can help you. But as far as being in the Julio Jones or Antonio Brown category, he was once in that category. He's not even close to that now. So they can't afford to pay him like a number 1 receiver. I think they realize it. We'll see how Dez wants to handle it. I mean, he's just not that guy anymore. So it's going to be a difficult situation for them.
Washington, obviously, they're apparently going to make that trade with Kirk Cousins becoming a free agent. But do they try to get fancy and bring Cousins back and then try to trade him?
I can't imagine they would, because remember, this is the 3rd consecutive franchise tag. So I forget the exact number, but I think it would be 33 or 34 million for Kirk Cousins to come back. So if I'm Kirk Cousins and they're going to put the franchise tag on me, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to sign the contract the minute they do it and say, okay, pay me $34 million. And the Redskins just can't afford to do that. And obviously that would dramatically affect his trade value because, hey, well, a ton of teams like him and a ton of teams want him to be their starting quarterback. Well, if you've got to pay him $34 million for 1 year, you're not giving up a first-round pick. Let's put it that way. So I think the Redskins have sort of put themselves in a box. And the reality is, I mean, Alex Smith is going to be their quarterback, and they're going to let Kirk Cousins walk. There's nothing much else they can do.
Right. Any initial teams you think make the most sense for Cousins?
Yeah, well, first and foremost, I would think Denver, because I think that's a playoff-level roster with a competent quarterback. He certainly is that. Minnesota as well. But I don't think that they would be willing to pay what he would want. And then you talk about Cleveland, obviously, if they're not comfortable with Sam Darnold at number 1 or Josh Rosen, maybe they can go in that direction. Another playoff team in Jacksonville. We all kind of know they say they're going to go forward with Blake Bortles, but I think we know what his ceiling is, and they could be a legitimate Super Bowl contender with a quarterback like Cousins. But I think, the one that makes the most sense right off the bat would be Denver.
What happens in Minnesota with those three guys?
That's a good question. I think Sam is the one who's not in the conversation, and I think it'll be interesting to see if someone pays him again and sort of crosses their fingers and hopes he can stay healthy. I can't imagine it, but every time he's up, somebody offers him big money. Ultimately, I think they might put the transition tag on Case Keenum. I don't think they would put the franchise tag on him. And I think they hope to bring Teddy Bridgewater back at a decent number and hope he's healthy. I don't think you're going to see anybody in the league throw significant money at a Teddy Bridgewater because nobody knows what he is physically or if he can hold up. So I think they would like to bring him back and sort of wait and see if he's healthy and let him compete and see what he has. So I think the best case scenario for them is probably bringing back Case Keenum and Teddy Bridgewater.
All right, very interesting stuff. The NFL, ESPN.com has their top 50 NFL free agents. We'll go through that list on tomorrow's show. 3 Eagles on that list. We have the article up at 97.3ESPN.com, but some interesting names at the top of that list. One we discussed today, that is Kirk Cousins. We'll do more on this list tomorrow with John McMullen at JF McMullen on Twitter. Thanks, pal.
Hey, thanks, Mike.